Some marriages end quietly, others end in courtrooms, but a few collapse in ways so shocking that they leave investigators, families, and entire communities asking how the person closest to the victim became the one who planned their final moments. Across Australia, detectives have confronted cases where wives didn't just walk away from a broken relationship, they crossed a line no one expected, turning ordinary homes into crime scenes. In today's chapter, we continue our deep dive into the minds of those wives whose crimes shook entire communities. Cases where couples whose lives appeared ordinary from the outside until behavior, control, or jealousy escalated into deadly decisions. These crimes weren't misunderstandings or accidents. They were moments where someone chose violence against the person they trusted most. So settle in, pay attention, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling stories don't come from strangers at all. They come from the people we trust our lives with.
You are watching Crime Insider. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video.
Katherine Knight, Aberdeen, New South Wales, 2000. On the morning of 1st March 2000, detectives entered a quiet home in Aberdeen after a neighbor reported blood near the front door. Inside, they found John Price lying in the hallway and his partner, Katherine Knight, unconscious in a back room. What officers saw in those first moments led to an immediate call for specialist investigators. The scene didn't match a break-in or a burglary. It suggested something far more deliberate, carried out by someone who knew the house, knew the victims, and took their time inside those walls. As forensic teams worked through the rooms, the routine missing person response vanished. Officers began documenting details that shifted the case from a domestic disturbance to one of the most complex crime scenes they had handled. Nothing about the layout made sense. Nothing aligned with what neighbors heard the night before. And nothing explained how a relationship that had seemed stable from the outside ended in such extreme violence behind closed doors. The deeper investigators moved into the house, the more a different question began shaping the early stages of the case. What had unfolded inside John Price's home before dawn? And why did the scene show signs of organized activity in a place where chaos should have been obvious? Detectives documenting the scene understood immediately that nothing inside the house happened without a reason. The pattern of injuries, the signs of struggle, and the absence of forced entry all pointed toward a situation shaped long before that final confrontation. To understand how John Price reached this moment, investigators started assembling the timeline of his past life, his daily routine, the people closest to him, and the relationship that had grown increasingly unstable in the years leading up to his death. John Price was 44, a respected mine worker in the Hunter Valley, and a father who stayed closely involved with his 3 children. He was known for being steady, reliable, and generous with his neighbors. His house in Aberdeen reflected the predictability of his routine. Co-workers often spoke about his dependability, how he rarely missed a shift, and how he went out of his way to help others. When John began seeing Katherine in the mid-1990s, friends initially believed he had simply entered another relationship after years of focusing on work and parenting. Katherine worked at the local butcher shop and had a strong presence in the community. People knew she was outspoken and sharp-tempered, but it wasn't until investigators spoke with earlier partners that they learned her history included severe arguments, unpredictable behavior, and incidents that had required police intervention. For John, the early stages of the relationship seemed manageable. He enjoyed the company and Katherine spent more time at his home. But by 1998, the tone had shifted. Their arguments were louder, more frequent, and increasingly tied to jealousy and control. That year, during one of their disputes, Katherine filmed old first aid kits John had taken from the mine's rubbish pile and sent the footage to his employer. The company treated it as theft. After 17 years on the job, John was dismissed. Investigators later documented this moment as the first major turning point. Friends said John was devastated. He ended the relationship immediately and told those close to him he would never take her back. But weeks later, they reconciled. Katherine returned to his life, though John refused to let her move back into the house. Those who visited him said the atmosphere had changed. People stopped dropping by. Co-workers told police they avoided visiting whenever Katherine's car was outside. By early 2000, the arguments had escalated again. One dispute ended with John receiving a stab wound to the chest. He forced Katherine out of the house and told friends he regretted allowing her back at all. Police would later note that this period showed a clear cycle: separation, reconciliation, and another surge of aggression. In February of that year, John started making preparations to end the relationship permanently. According to witness statements, he confided in colleagues that he was worried about what might happen if he followed through. His concerns were serious enough that he sought help at the local magistrate's court, applying for a restraining order. He stated that he needed protection for himself and his children, an action that became a significant point in the investigative timeline. His colleagues later told authorities that after leaving court, John appeared tense and unsettled. By the end of the workday, he admitted that he feared returning home but felt he didn't have a choice. He believed that staying away might put his children at risk if Katherine tried to find him. That night, he followed his usual routine, visiting neighbors briefly, then returning to his house alone. This was the final verifiable moment when John was seen carrying out an ordinary evening, and it was the point where investigators, rebuilding the timeline hour by hour, saw his path intersect directly with Katherine's decisions that night. By establishing this sequence, his warnings to co-workers, the restraining order, the long history of volatility, and the shrinking sense of safety inside the home, detectives built the foundation for the case. It allowed them to interpret the crime scene not as an isolated event, but as the final stage in a conflict that had been escalating for years. By examining receipts, witness accounts, and CCTV footage, investigators rebuilt the last full day before the crime. Katherine had spent the afternoon preparing matters that would later be interpreted as deliberate planning. She recorded video of her children, leaving emotional statements that resembled an informal farewell. She purchased new black lingerie, and she ensured John's children stayed elsewhere that night. John arrived home after visiting neighbors. He watched television, followed his usual routine, and went to bed. When Katherine reached the house later, she let herself in, watched TV briefly, showered, and entered the bedroom. Court summaries concluded the two had a quiet exchange before John eventually fell asleep. According to forensic reports, the first injury was delivered while he was still in bed. The angle and location of the initial wounds suggested he had been taken by surprise. Blood traces showed he woke up and attempted to move toward the light switch. From there, investigators mapped his path through the hallway, onto the front landing, and back inside. The pattern indicated he attempted to escape, but lost too much blood to continue. Once John collapsed, the struggle ended. His injuries were severe enough that investigators had no doubt he died within minutes. What happened afterward, inside that house, became the focus of headlines. But for detectives, emphasizing sequence and timeline, the crucial detail was that the entire violent struggle had unfolded within a matter of minutes. Nothing suggested outside involvement. Nothing pointed to a home invasion. Everything pointed inward, toward the partner he feared might take his life. When police entered the house the next morning, they found Katherine unconscious in a back room from an overdose of tablets. She was taken to hospital under guard. Officers on scene secured the house, notified superiors, and began an initial walkthrough. The call originally came in as a welfare check, but officers quickly saw that it was much more serious. Fresh blood, signs of a struggle, and the absence of any forced entry told investigators this was a targeted crime. Nothing about the layout indicated sudden panic or hurried escape. The scene looked deliberate. Forensic specialists documented 37 stab wounds on John's body. Medical examiners confirmed injuries to vital organs, consistent with repeated stabbing from both front and back. Police also traced a withdrawal from John's bank account, $1,000 removed shortly after his death. CCTV from the ATM captured Katherine completing the transaction. Inside the home, investigators found tools and materials that matched Katherine's work at the butchering skills. The presence of these items, along with the specific ways certain actions had been carried out, indicated knowledge of butchering skills and experience handling blades.
These details later became critical in court filings. The most confronting discovery came in the kitchen. Officers found a large pot on the stove and plates set out on the table. Each plate had the name of one of John's children placed beside it. The sentencing judgment later described this setup as methodical and intentional. A handwritten note accusing John of harming Katherine's family was found nearby. Investigators determined that those accusations were false. Sentencing records stated that, after John's death, Katherine used her butchering skills to remove parts of his body and prepare them in the kitchen. The combination of kitchen evidence, the timeline of injuries, the ATM withdrawal, and Katherine's presence in the home removed any doubt. Prosecutors prepared a case based on overwhelming physical evidence, deliberate staging, and the established pattern of escalating hostility in the relationship. Investigators next turned to the question of mental state. Psychiatric evaluations acknowledged long-term trauma and a history of volatile behavior. But all three specialists agreed on a central point. Katherine was capable of understanding her actions and forming intent. There was no basis for a diminished responsibility defense. With that conclusion, detectives moved the case into the charging phase. Katherine Knight was charged with the murder of John Price. Early discussions with her legal team involved an attempt to offer a plea to manslaughter, but prosecutors rejected it. The evidence did not support a lesser charge. The murder trial was scheduled for mid-2001, but experienced delays. When jury selection finally took place, potential jurors were told they could withdraw if they felt unable to handle the evidence. Several did. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Even seasoned officers were uneasy about presenting complete details. But before opening statements began, Katherine unexpectedly announced she would plead guilty. Justice Barry O'Keefe ordered an overnight psychiatric assessment to confirm she understood the consequences. The next morning, she again confirmed the plea. Because she admitted guilt, the trial moved directly to sentencing. Prosecutors outlined the timeline, the physical evidence, the preparation captured on video, and the behavior inside the home after John's death. They argued the crime reflected planning, intention, and a degree of control that placed the case among the most extreme examples of interpersonal violence. Justice O'Keefe agreed. On 8 November 2001, he sentenced Katherine to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, marking the first time a woman in Australia had received such a sentence. He directed that her papers be marked "never to be released." Katherine later appealed, claiming the sentence was excessive. In 2006, the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed the appeal, stating the crime was appalling and had no comparable cases in the state's legal history. She was transferred to Silverwater Women's Correctional Center, where she remains under the life without parole order. As the case entered the public record, the reaction across Australia was immediate and intense. Many had never heard of a crime of this nature occurring in a domestic setting. Media outlets covered the story extensively, relying on court statements to avoid speculation. Commentators emphasized how deeply the case challenged assumptions about warning signs and the hidden dangers inside certain relationships. John Price's family endured enormous grief. His children, who were teenagers at the time, later spoke about the long-term trauma and how difficult it was to process both the loss and the manner in which it occurred. Community members in Aberdeen described a shift in atmosphere, a sense of shock that something so extreme had happened in a quiet town where people rarely locked their doors. The case prompted renewed discussion about protective orders. Although restraining orders existed, many Australians questioned whether the system had enough enforcement power to keep individuals safe when threats escalated. Advocates pointed to John's attempts to seek protection and the fact that he felt returning home was the only option to ensure his children's safety. Policymakers later referenced this case when pushing for more robust support pathways. In the years that followed, the case became one of the most cited examples in Australian criminal law classes, used to illustrate how evidence, planning, and intent are evaluated in sentencing decisions. It also became a cautionary example for police training around escalating relationship conflict and the importance of early intervention. Even decades later, the shock surrounding the case has not faded. Residents who lived through the events still recall the moment they heard what had happened inside that house. Many described disbelief, followed by a lingering awareness that danger inside a home is not always visible from the outside.
Rebecca Payne, Walpup, Victoria, 2020. On the early morning of September 1, 2020, detectives were called to a neighbor's yard after a young man opened a discarded chest freezer and found what looked like a blanket-wrapped body inside. When officers lifted the lid, they discovered 68-year-old Noel Payne, secured with duct tape and straps, his remains preserved in the cold. Just a few houses down lived his wife, Rebecca Payne, who had told neighbors the freezer held spoiled meat and needed to be moved. Nothing at the scene matched the brief explanation she had given that morning. As investigators surveyed the yard and the Payne home, the story became even less consistent. The freezer had been relocated, Noel's belongings were missing, and no one in the household could clearly explain when they last saw him alive. Officers noted the quietness of the property, the absence of any sign of forced entry, and the way the concealment suggested planning rather than panic. Nothing about the layout of events aligned with what they were told. The deeper detectives looked, the more one question shaped the direction of the case. Why had Noel been placed inside a freezer near his own home, and how had the situation inside that household reached the point where no one reported him missing? Investigators treating the freezer in the neighbor's yard as a crime scene knew this was not a sudden event. The way Noel Payne had been stored suggested a situation that had been building for years. To understand how Noel ended up in that chest freezer, they started with the life he shared with his wife, Rebecca Payne. Noel lived on a disability pension and spent much of his time at home in the small northwest Victorian town of Walpup. Rebecca, a mother of 6, was officially his carer. Court findings record that they married in 2006, and for a time their arrangement looked ordinary from the outside. They had 2 sons together. Behind that, the relationship was far from stable. Sentencing remarks later recorded repeat separations in 2008 and 2012 after violence and controlling behavior inside the home. When Rebecca left, Noel brought another woman into the house, a younger person with a cognitive impairment. When Rebecca returned, all 3 lived together under Noel's authority. Evidence accepted by the Supreme Court described a pattern of long-term mistreatment. Noel used physical force, controlled money, and dictated where Rebecca went. On one occasion, in a cemetery, he kicked her while she was on the ground. Both women were pressured into getting multiple tattoos of his name across their bodies. Appeal judges later said Rebecca had lived in an intolerable and inescapable environment for more than a decade.
The final days of Noel's life began quietly. In late August 2020, Rebecca obtained a prescription for temazepam to manage sleep problems. Around the same time, she received a lemon biscuit recipe from a friend and tried it. On 1 September 2020, she made a second batch. This time, one biscuit was different. Court documents state that Rebecca crushed at least 7 temazepam tablets, mixed the powder into icing, and spread it over a single biscuit. That biscuit was then set aside for Noel. Later that day, Rebecca gave Noel the altered biscuit along with a hot drink, reported in evidence as a chocolate malt drink he often consumed. Toxicology results would later show 69 milligrams of temazepam in his system, a very high level for the medication. Rebecca told investigators that at some point she found Noel slumped at his computer and could not rouse him. She checked for a pulse and believed he had died. What she did next became one of the central issues in the trial. Instead of contacting emergency services, she treated him as deceased. There was no call for help, no attempt to bring paramedics to the house, and no report made to police. From that moment onward, every step Rebecca took was later examined in court as evidence of how she understood what she had done that afternoon. After deciding Noel was dead, Rebecca moved to conceal his body. Evidence presented at trial described how she wrapped him in a blanket, secured the ends with duct tape, and used a wheelbarrow to transport him to a chest freezer in the backyard. She placed him inside, closed the lid, and tightened straps over the top to hold it shut. For the next 3 days, Noel remained in that freezer. The other woman and the children stayed on the property. Inside, decisions were being made about what story would be told if anyone asked where Noel had gone. The day after his death, Rebecca, the other woman, and some of the children drove to Mildura. Using Noel's bank card, they went shopping. Court reports state they bought pets and other goods. At the same time, Rebecca began telling people that Noel had left. In different versions, she said he had taken thousands of dollars in cash, his laptop, clothing, and gone off with another woman. On 4 September 2020, she approached a neighbor and asked if she could leave what she described as a broken freezer with spoiled meat in their yard for later collection. That freezer contained Noel's body. The neighbor agreed. When the freezer was eventually opened, police were called and the property was treated as a crime scene. Detectives and forensic staff documented the scene. Toxicology confirmed the high temazepam level. Investigators recorded the blanket, the duct tape, the wheelbarrow, and the straps around the freezer. In combination with the shopping trip, the use of Noel's money, and the false stories about his disappearance, police and prosecutors built a picture of deliberate action rather than shock or panic. When the case reached the Supreme Court in Mildura, Rebecca did not deny her role in Noel's death. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter, acknowledging that she had given him the drugged biscuit, but she pleaded not guilty to murder, arguing that she had only meant to sedate him and gain a break from ongoing harm, not to end his life. The prosecution argued the steps she took showed more than a desire for rest. They pointed to the prescription temazepam, the specific biscuit altered with crushed tablets, the decision to give it to Noel, and the failure to seek medical help when he became unresponsive. They emphasized that she then wrapped his body, hid it in a freezer, drove to Mildura to spend his money, and told friends he had run off with cash and belongings. In their view, this sequence showed planning and an understanding that Noel was not coming back. The defense focused on context. They presented the long history of control and violence accepted in sentencing remarks. They argued that years of mistreatment had distorted Rebecca's thinking, that she believed there was no safe way to leave, and that her intention had been to knock Noel out temporarily. They asked the jury to find that while her actions were serious and unlawful, they fell short of murder. The trial lasted 15 days. Jurors heard from medical experts, the other woman in the household, police, and neighbors. On 15 March 2023, the jury delivered its decision. Rebecca was found guilty of murder. At sentencing in June 2023, Justice Rita Inserti faced two realities. On one hand, Noel had been deliberately drugged, placed in a freezer, and hidden from authorities. On the other, the court accepted that Rebecca had lived for years in what the judge described as a cruel and controlling environment. Balancing those factors, Justice Inserti imposed a 16-year prison term with a 10-year non-parole period, describing the killing as a lower-range example of murder. Rebecca appealed both her conviction and her sentence. In 2024, the conviction appeal argued that some of the prosecution's comments during the trial had gone too far, including claims about the number of tablets used and suggestions that the freezer itself contributed to Noel's death. The Court of Appeal rejected those arguments, finding the jury's verdict was supported by the evidence and leaving the murder conviction in place. On sentence, the appeal judges took a different view. In a detailed judgment, they said the original term was manifestly excessive given the extraordinary level of harm Rebecca had endured. They reduced her sentence to 12 years with a 7-year non-parole period, noting that she had spent much of her adult life under Noel's control and would now spend most of her 40s in custody. The court made clear, however, that the abuse did not justify the killing. It reduced her moral responsibility, but did not erase it. Outside the courtroom, reaction to the case was mixed. Some people in the community and parts of the media framed Rebecca as a victim whose actions followed years of mistreatment. Others focused on Noel's death and the way his body was treated, saying that no level of mistreatment could excuse what happened in that house and freezer. For advocates working in this area, the case became a reference point in discussions about coercive control, homicide law, and how courts should weigh long-term harm when victims themselves become offenders. For Noel's relatives and those who had known him in the town, the outcome did not undo the loss. They were left with a verdict, a sentence, and findings that recognized both his death and the damage he had caused inside his own home. For Rebecca and her children, the case meant years of separation and ongoing questions about whether earlier intervention could have prevented what happened. The drugged biscuit, the freezer in the yard, and a small community watching a long-term relationship end in murder charges and a prison term instead of a safe exit.
Dale Vella, Batman, New South Wales, 2021.
Detectives arrived at a rural Batman property on 9 August 2021 after a call to the emergency helpline reported a man found unresponsive in his bed with a head injury. Inside the house, officers discovered 52-year-old Mark Vella lying on his mattress with a fatal gunshot wound near his eye. His wife, Dale Vella, was in the home when police arrived, along with other family members who had gathered after the incident. Nothing in the bedroom indicated forced entry, and there were no signs of a struggle around the bed. As investigators documented the room, they noted the shotgun on the floor, the undisturbed bedding, and the absence of any movement from Mark before the shot was fired. They were told he was legally blind and that only the occupants of the home were present through the night. The position of the firearm, the stillness of the space, and the timing of the call created immediate uncertainty about how the sequence of events had developed. The more detectives examined the early details, the more confusing one question became. How had a man been shot at close range while lying in his own bed, and why did investigators find no signs of anyone entering the property from outside? When detectives began examining the home on the morning of 9 August 2021, their first task was to build a practical understanding of who had been inside the property overnight and what routines shaped the household. 52-year-old Mark Vella was known to family and neighbors as a man who lived a quiet life due to his vision impairment. His wife, Dale Vella, managed most of the daily responsibilities inside the property, including safety arrangements, medication schedules, and general household organization. According to police summaries later tendered in court, several family members had either stayed in the home or visited regularly, meaning investigators needed a precise timeline of overnight movements before narrowing the field of inquiry. Officers began by interviewing those present in the home at the time of the emergency call. They documented where each person said they had been located before the gunshot was heard, and how long it took for anyone to realize Mark had suffered a fatal injury. Statements recorded that morning described a household preparing for an ordinary start to the day, with no reported arguments, disruptions, or unexpected visitors during the night. Investigators cross-referenced these accounts with their initial walkthrough of the property, ensuring the physical environment aligned with what was described verbally. As the hours progressed, detectives worked to establish whether Mark had been awake at any point before the gunshot was fired. Because of his blindness, investigators needed confirmation on whether he kept predictable waking habits or whether he required assistance moving through the home. The layout of the bedroom, the consistent position of items on his bedside table, and the lack of disturbance to surrounding objects suggested he had been lying in bed without movement prior to the injury. This observation supported the developing view that Mark had not reacted to the event, either due to sleep or the limitations of his vision. By midday, detectives began securing and cataloging items relevant to the investigation. The firearm found on the bedroom floor was treated as a key focus point. Officers documented its position relative to the bed, the angle in which it was resting, and whether anything around it showed signs of displacement. Court documents later noted that no evidence of forced entry had been detected anywhere in the house, a detail that shaped how investigators approached the earliest line of inquiry. With no external access points disturbed, detectives turned their attention exclusively to the people who had been inside the property. The first chapter of the inquiry concluded with detectives identifying a critical objective, determining exactly who had access to the firearm and how it was stored before the incident. This procedural step marked the transition into a deeper examination of the household's internal dynamics, a review that would guide the next phase of investigation. With the immediate scene documented, investigators began reconstructing the relationship between Mark and Dale as it existed in the months leading up to his death. According to statements later summarized in court proceedings, the couple had been together for decades and shared a home life shaped by routine surrounding Mark's limited vision.
Detectives collected accounts from relatives, neighbors, and friends to understand whether any conflicts had been reported, whether firearms were routinely handled in the home, and whether anyone outside the household had knowledge of the couple's private matters. Police reviewed phone logs, messages, and recent communications to establish whether any external stressors had influenced the dynamic between Mark and Dale. Witnesses reported that the couple had faced pressures common in long-term relationships, but nothing in these early accounts suggested an external threat. There were no documented reports of stalking, intrusion, or suspicious activity around the home. This absence of outside involvement reinforced the significance of the finding that no forced entry had occurred before the emergency call. Investigators then evaluated health records and communications regarding Mark's medical needs. His blindness had worsened over time, and officers needed to determine how independently he could move through the house or handle objects without assistance. These details mattered for one reason: to understand whether it was physically possible for Mark to have interacted with the firearm himself. Reporting from the period later noted that detectives treated this assessment as essential in narrowing the possible explanations for what had occurred overnight. By the end of the second day of interviews, detectives had collected an extensive chronology of the couple's evening, including meal times, room movements, and who last saw Mark alive before the bedroom door was closed for the night. Each detail was logged and cross-referenced against the physical evidence. This structured approach ensured investigators avoided assumptions and focused solely on what could be verified. The direction of inquiry continued to narrow, anchored by the fact that the firearm had been discharged inside a locked home with no external disturbance. This conclusion set the framework for the next stage, where investigators moved from general household dynamics to the specific conduct and statements of those who had been closest to Mark during the final hours of his life. As detectives revisited earlier statements, they identified discrepancies in how certain events were described. Variations emerged in the accounts of when the gunshot was first heard, how long it took before anyone entered the bedroom, and who initiated the contact with emergency services. Investigators reconstructed these statements on a timeline, comparing them against the logical progression of events expected after the sound of a firearm discharge inside a quiet home. Forensic specialists processed the bedroom more thoroughly, assessing blood patterns, firearm residue, and the trajectory of the shot. According to later court evidence, the angle and positioning of the discharge indicated a close-range shot while Mark remained under the bedding. This supported earlier observations that he was likely asleep or unaware at the moment the gun triggered. The firearm's placement on the floor did not align with a self-inflicted scenario, and experts documented the surrounding bedding to confirm that it had not been disturbed by sudden movement. Officers reviewed the telecommunications timeline to determine whether anyone had contacted relatives or neighbors before calling emergency services. They also documented the behavior of those inside the house immediately after the shot was heard. Investigators sought clarity on whether the response had been immediate or delayed, as this factor appeared inconsistent across early accounts. Any delay between hearing a firearm discharge and entering the bedroom became relevant in determining the household's internal reactions. By this stage, investigators had ruled out external intrusion with certainty. The absence of forced entry combined with locked doors and broken window frames made it clear that no outsider had entered the home during the night. This finding supported the focus on internal factors and the behavior of those present during the time frame when Mark sustained the fatal injury. As the forensic picture tightened, detectives prepared to compile their findings for prosecutorial review. The combination of scene reconstruction, witness statements, and forensic interpretation guided investigators toward the next procedural step, a formal charging decision based on the evidence gathered. Following the completion of the forensic assessments, police prepared the brief of evidence for prosecutors. The material included experts' conclusions regarding the shooting distance, weapon handling, and the physical impossibility of outside involvement. The prosecutorial review led to the decision to formally charge Dale Vella with murder. She was taken into custody and brought before the courts, where the charges were read and an initial plea was entered.
Court filings outlined the prosecution's position that Mark's death was not the result of an accidental discharge, but a deliberate act carried out while he was asleep and unable to resist or react. The prosecution relied heavily on the forensic trajectory analysis and the bedding evidence, which supported their theory that Mark had not moved or been aware at the moment of the discharge.
The defense challenged these interpretations, arguing that the prosecution's timeline was inconsistent with certain elements of the household statements and that reasonable doubt existed regarding the exact circumstances surrounding the discharge. Defense submissions centered on questions of intent, opportunity, and the possibility of unintended handling of the firearm. The court scheduled pretrial hearings to determine which expert reports would be admitted, how the prosecution intended to present the trajectory analysis, and whether the defense would call independent specialists to provide alternative interpretations. These hearings were essential in shaping how the trial would proceed and what information the jury would ultimately consider. The matter then progressed toward trial, with both sides preparing detailed narratives built upon the information collected in the months following Mark's death. During the trial, prosecutors presented the forensic reports, telecommunications data, and witness testimony outlining the final hours of Mark's life. They emphasized the close-range nature of the shooting and the lack of any plausible explanation involving accidental discharge. The defense countered by highlighting uncertainties and raising alternative possibilities, arguing that the evidence did not conclusively establish intent. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder. Sentencing was later handed down by the Supreme Court, where the judge considered the gravity of the act, the vulnerability of a sleeping and visually impaired victim, and the need to reinforce community expectations of safety within the home. Dale Vella received a sentence reflecting these factors, with a non-parole period proportionate to the seriousness of the offense. Public reaction to the case reflected a mixture of shock, confusion, and concern. Many questioned how a death inside a stable household could escalate into a homicide trial. Others focused on the broader issue of firearm storage and access, particularly in homes where vulnerable occupants required additional care. Media coverage emphasized the forensic clarity of the case, but also the emotional strain placed on the extended family, who were forced to reconcile the death of one relative with the imprisonment of another. For those who knew Mark, the conclusion of the trial brought a measure of finality, but not closure. His death reshaped the lives of friends and relatives who had previously viewed the household as safe and predictable. For the wider community, the case served as a reminder that even familiar environments can conceal private tensions or overlooked risks. The legal process delivered a clear outcome, but the circumstances inside the home, the shot fired while a man slept, and the subsequent explanations tested in court left lasting questions about what early signs, if any, might have changed the course of events before they reached a fatal point.